Let's
Yeah.
see if you can hang it
Yeah, it should hang there.
in the middle of the thing. I'll probably clunk it down. That'll work.
Yeah, or even here. It's
Yeah,
fine.
I think that's better.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can also grab it from you if you need.
Okay.
Don't feel bothered.
No, thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say something about why she selected that poem. So you can say whatever you want. I'm not gonna speak about us individually, I'm just gonna talk about us as a group. So anything you wanna say about yourself, say it. Or will you start? And I'm sure it's yours that way, because I have no personality. She gave me lipstick, in fact, because I did a TV interview and he said,
Thank you. That's okay.
Okay, so here's one thing. It's too heavy, it's too heavy. You can like take it to the shoemaker. I know, I usually
yeah.
go off
Okay, let me just check and see if it's okay.
You ready?
yeah.
You ready? Good evening. Welcome to Keese School Spring Semester, Month 2. I'm Kathleen O'Toole, and we, myself, Christine Higgins, Ann Lolordo, and Madeline Misko, are delighted to be back at the Keese School. 2 years ago, we presented our poetry and some reflections on what moves us to write to a receptive audience in Hefner. Great conversation, great questions. Poets are not used to that, by the way. Since we'll introduce ourselves individually when we read, I'm just going to say something about us as a group and how we'll proceed tonight. We first connected in the early 1990s out of our desire to grow as poets after we had each spent a very intense 1 year at Johns Hopkins University in the Masters in Creative Arts, the writing seminars. We were all in our 30s and 40s with busy family and professional lives. Other poets, all women, joined us, came and went, but the four of us are still at it more than 30 years later. So here we are in our 60s and 70s at Asbury Methodist Village. So we thought we would explore with you the ways poetry can be a gift for all of us as we age. So let me start with a few questions for you. How many of you regularly turn to poetry for enjoyment or uplift or just to make sense of the world? Just raise your hands. I know a couple of people would. And does anyone here find poetry a little bit intimidating? I'm looking at you, John Ruthroff. Yeah, us too. Does anybody here wish you had a better on-ramp or way to enter poetry? Welcome to the club. And who here has actually tried their hand at writing a poem or two at some point? Go Asbury, all right. Well, if you have a burning question about poetry, or you have a question when you hear us read about a poem or about how we write, hold on to that, because the last time we were here, for us, the richest part of our program was the conversation we had after. So we really welcome your questions. So here's how we plan to proceed. First, we've each selected a poem by a well-known poet as an example of what draws us to poetry, especially at this time in our lives. There are some handouts, which I think most of you got, of the 4 poems we selected, because we thought for some people it's helpful to have the words in front of them, and maybe that'll get you into the flow of poems and words. And then after that, each of us will present a set of 3 poems of our own, which we hope will lead us to some good questions on your part and conversation between us. So even though it's not the first on your program, I'm going to start because I'm standing here. I am going to read a poem that has been important to me over many years. And it's a poem that I go to sometimes when I catch myself feeling a little sorry for myself, and also sometimes, well, at times like these, when I just need to remind myself of what's really important. Kindness by Naomi Shihab Nye. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever.
Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore, only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out in the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. Anne?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having us. I chose this poem by Mary Oliver called Wild Geese for two reasons. I finally retired after 40-some-odd years of work in late August, and quite frankly, I was feeling a bit sorry for myself, I think. I'd spent so many years with a clear mission and purpose, and here I was trying to cobble together a purposeful life through volunteers or classes. And the Mary Oliver poem kind of showed me that I had to get out of my own way, and I think you'll hear that in the poem. And the other reason I chose it is that given the profession I had, I traveled widely, and that was always a source of inspiration for me. Now I'm home, and I'm finding myself going to a different source, and that's nature. And Mary Oliver is a wonderful poet who has a great command of nature. Wild geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
Good evening, everybody. So nice to see you all out there. Kathleen said that we would be reading poems by well-known poets. Actually, I'm reading a poem by Anne Porter, who was not particularly well-known. A little bit about her. I was introduced to Anne Porter by one of my teachers, the poet Dana Gioia, when I was studying poetry many years ago. And Gioia had just been on the board that selected the committee for the National Book Award. And they had nominated Porter's collection for a prize. At the time, Anne Porter was in her 80s. And she'd been writing poetry whenever she could for for a number of years, but she published very little. And she was mostly known as the wife of the celebrated American painter Fairfield Porter. I admire Anne Porter's poems very much. From the first I read them, for their simplicity and their brevity, and the celebration of nature, the natural world, sort of as a divine gift, and for her great attention to detail. And I admired her as a poet because it was obvious that she had been writing poetry for a long time and getting much from it, and never really was concerned too much about getting it published. And I thought that was very admirable. So the poem I'm going to read is On My Mother's Birthday. On my mother's birthday, and she would have written this poem when she was in her probably mid-70s. On my mother's birthday, the thunderstorm is over. The gray cloud cover has been dismantled. The broken clouds are bundled off together, leaving a clear blue sky. The pear tree is in blossom. Dark purple buds are forming on lilac bushes. The Star of Bethlehem and buttercups are just beginning to open in the grass. Lighter than air, the small white cabbage butterflies are lifted as they dance. And now, for the first time since winter ended, I hear the tumbling music of the wren. Innocent messengers, you have split winter open and brought us your transparent beauty. That's doubly beautiful because you are not like us, because you cannot lie.
Hi, everybody. Wonderful to be here with you tonight. And the poem that I'm going to read, which I think I might actually begin by talking about it, it's a poem by Billy Collins. How many people have heard of Billy Collins? Yeah, a lot of you. And he's a poet. He was our poet laureate in 2001 until 2003. And not unlike the other poems you've heard tonight, there's a great accessibility. We don't really have to know too much or translate too much, kind of archaic language or things like that. So that's why people like it. It's simple and it's relatable. I also thought I'd mention, I think you can see this online. He read this poem at the Dodge Poetry Festival, a very famous poetry festival. And the way he reads it is pretty much straight-faced. So I have to catch myself because I tend to, emote things. But so here it is, forgetfulness. And of course, when you hear it, you might recognize some things for yourself. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. As if one by one, the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago, you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye and watched the quadratic equation pack its bag, and even now, as you memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away. A state flower, perhaps, the address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay. Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue, not even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It has floated away down a dark mythological river whose name begins with an L, as far as you can recall. Well on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have even forgotten how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart. So, and of course, the beauty of humor, right? The beauty of humor, as we've talked about, is solace, something to just give you a little chuckle or smile. And also, I think, so the reasons why, I'm going to start with my poems. The reason why I chose what I chose to read was because I kind of got hooked on this idea, which is in Billy Collins's poem about transitioning. And since we've already introduced the subject of learning to ride, well, of remembering how to ride a bike, I thought this might be appropriate. So this poem is called Blue Skies. There was a time when the two older siblings had two-wheelers, and she had a tricycle. She remembers riding that red tricycle with the other two, but how did they learn how to balance themselves? And she did not. When she took driver's ed, the teacher said, "It's like riding a bike." She kept her secret, but had difficulty with the most basic thing. You turn the steering wheel to the right, and the car turns to the right. When she was 30, she asked her brother for help. She was going on a trip with her new boyfriend, and he was expecting them to ride bikes on a trail at least 10 miles long on a pine tree island. Right away, her sister-in-law said, "It's not possible. You're too old." True, her brother couldn't guide her like a small child, hold her steady, or even run a bit on the way with her. She rode the same piece of his street, parked cars on either side. Every time she thought she might fall, she squeezed the brakes hard and jumped from the seat. It gave her terrible black and blue marks on her thighs. She could barely make it home standing on the train. She had to not bend her legs, but attempt to flop into bed, the pillow such a welcome relief. She slept a solid sleep, dreamed her dream of making love in satin sheets. That day, the blue skies praised her efforts. The man she loved captured her riding through a stone tunnel, smiling towards him. He never knew what she accomplished. One picnic of raspberries and biscuits, and she fell in love with herself. And then I'm dedicating this poem to John, Madeline's husband, because don't you know, as we were seated at dinner, we were talking about memorizing poems when you were in grammar school or high school, and he said, "Oh, I'll tell you what poem I memorized." And the name of it, for me, is Little Cat Feet. So the epigraph is, which is simply a reference to the nature of the poem, is by Carl Sandburg. Yes, "The fog comes in on little cat feet." Okay, some of you know it. Sister Antonia, our sophomore English teacher, would often glide into the classroom. Her long robes hid everything but the tips of her shoes. We saw a whiff of her dark brown hair sprouting from the white wimple that crowned her face. Rosary beads hung perfectly straight from her leather belt. On a grizzly gray day in her class, without saying good morning, as was her usual, Sister Antonia glided over to the long, half-open casement window. She rested her elbows on top of the lower frame. Beyond the window, you could see the dark green trees in the mist. She whispered, half to us, half to herself, "The fog comes in on little cat feet. She lingered there dramatically. She wanted us to be swept away, too. We teenage girls with our silly cares didn't know what she was talking about, didn't know it was a line of poetry. At lunch, we mocked her, and I joined in, agreed that she was so weird. Once she separated the class, putting me and my friends in rows she called the graveyard, because we didn't participate enough. Then we had to sit there mute while other students got to discuss the star-crossed lovers, Romeo and Juliet. Sister Antonia, I think of her often. She may be passing her time in the old nun's home or long gone by now. I think of her always in the early morning fog. And my last poem is from this is a book that my husband and I published together. It's called Plum Point Folio, and my husband's a photographer, and he took the photographs, and I wrote the poems. We didn't really do it in tandem, but sometimes there was a sense that something I had written went with one of his photographs, or somehow we kind of intentionally blended them together. And in the spirit of transition, I was looking to see if there was something I could read from here, because we have the book here. Feel free to look through it if you want to see the photographs. So this poem is called Natural Habitat, and it's another poem that's a transition. So maybe you're familiar with that idea that you're in one place in your life, you're living in one place, and then suddenly you have a whole new journey or a new way of being in another place. So, and I spent many years in New York. So, Natural Habitat, 1, New York. I learned how to squeeze myself into a rush hour subway car, how to maneuver throngs of people on Fifth Avenue without so much as grazing another shoulder, how to order my morning takeout when the counter lady hollered, "Next!" I know how to step off the curb and hail a cab. I love the museums, the big name department stores, the famous buildings. I walked everywhere, drank in the riotous colors, orange umbrellas, red flowers in buckets, yellow taxis, hot pink, and cool blue neon. 2, the Chesapeake Bay. My life is taken up with walking the shoreline, picking up remnants of ship iron, shark's teeth, and beach glass. I've learned the stingray and the skate are both in the batoid family, but have different kinds of teeth. Near Calvert Cliffs, I search for fossils made when the sea level fell and rose over 10 million years. I watch the heron drop his legs behind him like a dancer as he flies out over the water. When the sun sets, it casts a pink spell on the slow-moving tankers. Thank you very much. Thank you. Gotta get a little pink.
The first poem I'm going to read, just let me tell you a little bit about myself, and I think you'll understand the poem. I spent most of my career as a journalist, so time was critical in the kind of work that I did. I wrote on deadline more often than not, so time really was a bookend in my work. The other thing you need to know about me is that I'm always the shoulda, woulda, coulda girl. Should have done this, I could have done that, and I'm always sort of checking myself. But now I find that it's more important to really think of time in the moment of time. Ground effect. We traveled through the golden reeds of autumn, kayaking our way deep into the marsh, a landscape aflame. Silent in the aura of afternoon light, we pause and watch geese skim dark waters, hundreds barely aloft, the ground effect offering safe passage to a destination unknown. How often did we find ourselves aloft, hurtling to places unknown, skimming treetops, skirting mountain ranges and thunderclouds, weathering the turbulence and evading detection to land amid the mangroves? Now we find ourselves outside of time, floating silently in a Chincoteague inlet. No talk of regrets, other lives, missed opportunities, what might have been in the exuberance of love. No, we sit quietly, reverent, two aging paddlers grounded in the stillness of a shining red October, asking no questions, promising nothing. You know, people often say to me, well, where did that poem come from? So this is an attempt to interrogate that question, and it led me somewhere I don't think I knew initially when I started. Origins. Why didn't Mother choose her over me, that wounded bird of a sister? Bird is the wrong metaphor. My sister is more cat-like, defensive, pacing, mewling or screaming, ready to spring or pounce, claws bared. In a fit of hurt, I demanded of my mother, why her? As I limped through those first weeks after my son's birth, breasts rock hard, the boy wailing, my husband sleepless, I knew how she would respond. Because she needs me. The conversation returns to me 22 years later in a free writing class with the prompt, where does a poem come from? An ache, a longing, a desire to know the world, to experience mystery, to learn why swans mate for life, to understand Van Gogh's obsession with cypress trees, to name the bird walking sideways up an oak, to celebrate the birth of a child after a decade of trying, to mark an occasion, an inauguration perhaps, to observe the earth from the moon, to interrogate history, to defang a monster, to explore the unknowable, to address a grievance, to right a wrong, to relinquish the will to be remembered, to reconcile a mother's choice for one daughter and not another. The last poem I'm going to read is pretty self-explanatory. I don't think there's anything in here that you won't recognize. Reluctant Gardener. Digging to find a place for the catmint, the stony ground refusing to yield, I persist. I am not a gardener. Hate dirt under my nails, burrs in my hair, rely on Advil to get through it. But the yard beckons, filled with boxes of blooms, sparkling sapphires, dianthus, a frothy baptisia, lemon meringue, and lantana, a sunburst of flame and panicked pinks. This spring, I'm compulsively planting. Locked down, shut out from my usual haunts, I reach for claw and scoop, bone and blood meal, compost tea. The garden, as stubborn as can be, offers a respite from the death count. Bodies stacked in refrigerator trucks, the proliferation of colors erasing the image of health workers with face mask scars, a tattoo for our times, the dying left unattended. Sweating, I carry on amid the bearded irises and verbena pushing through clay, the delphinium and buttercups proliferating across a parched hill. I yank and pull the weeds and clover before reaching for the double peony, budding with the promise of healing and the blush of a new day. Thank you.
I'm going to start with two poems that probably don't need much introduction at all, and then I'll have an introduction, a little explanatory for the last poem I'm going to read. This first poem, a nature poem along the lines of Ann Porter's interest in nature, is entitled Old Sycamore in Winter. It is a sonnet. Maybe you'll be able to hear. It actually has some rhyme in it. It's actually a sonnet that I wrote a long time ago, and then very recently pulled out again and looked at and revised it a good bit to match the age that I am now. Old sycamores in winter. And now it's me who's old, who's making do with Shakespeare's that time of year metaphor, when suddenly, late afternoon, this view of frozen fields and woods completely bare is shot right through with something like a high. Those big old sycamores along the creek, their bare-bone limbs against the winter sky, the distinguishing pattern of the bark. I love the heavy grace of these old trees, standing so tall and sisterly in line. I love the way, as evening shadows rise, they hold their mottled faces to the sun. It almost seems the light is filtered through the autumn leaves that blew off months ago. This next poem is it's the peas, make the noise there. This next poem is entitled Mockingbirds. I don't think you need to have any introduction to it. I'm going to sing a little bit in this one, warning. Mockingbirds, flash of white tail and wing patches, a mockingbird rowing against the November sky. It settles high in the old holly across the street on the lawn of the Presbyterian home. A block away, another is singing loudly from a bare dogwood, its breast gleaming with morning light. The one in the holly answers, a long and complicated song, continual reprise. Excellent songsters, the guidebook says. Their repertoires include the calls of other birds expertly warbled into their own. They nest in hedges, along roadsides, in gardens among the multiflora roses. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Papa's gonna buy you a mockingbird. Their small bodies carry melodies that notation cannot hold, not ever. They release them to the changing skies, to their young, their throats open to song, sometimes even in the dead of the night. And if that mockingbird won't sing, then let it go, my heart, let it go. And this last poem does need a little bit of introduction. Excuse me. I do have it here. So For the past few years, I've had a writing project. I've been writing new poems inspired by my interest in fabric and the things that we do with fabric: clothing, drapery, altar cloths, art installations, bedding. So this last poem is one of those fabric poems. It's my response to a visit to the American Visionary Arts Museum here, not here in Baltimore, to see the works of a wonderful artist, Esther Nisenthal-Krinitz, a Polish-Jewish artist of fabric and thread, who told the story of her childhood during the Holocaust through her embroidery. And I have my dear poet friend Anne Lordo to thank for this poem, because it was Anne. It always helps to have good poet friends. And knowing my project urged me to go to see this exhibit, and I was just bowled over by the work of Esther Krinitz. The title of the poem is embroidered. It has a subtitle, Zabina, October 30th, 1942, needlework panel, Esther Nisenthal-Krinitz, 1994. In the American Visionary Arts Museum, 36 large panels, so many stitches Esther had to make to tell her children and grandchildren that story of survival. Beds of flowers, leaves in changing colors, fields of cabbages and strawberries, borders of trees dotted with apples, and those bee houses, each bearing one cluster of golden bees that elsewhere in the panel swarm darkly above the heads of the startled Nazi soldiers. October 30th, 1942, takes my breath. From across the room, I see how the light has been made to shine within the grays of evening, there at the half-open door, behind the neighbor, Zabina, and also at the window where the curtain is parted, where Zabina's 4 children, wide-eyed, ranged oldest to youngest, are staring out. About works of art that seem to capture the real, Simone Weil wrote that what we're actually seeing is the light of God filling the artist. I see it there at the door where Zabina is about to turn Esther and her little sister Mania away. I move closer to read the caption, stitched tidily in white on black. She told us we had to leave because the Gestapo were looking for the Jews. Picture Esther, the artist, a grandmother now, choosing the fabric that will become the light. Pink, like a sunset in autumn, a bit of sheen to it. Picture her threading the needle, embroidering Zabina, the flowered scarf tied at the shin, the eyes lowered, barely a curve to the mouth, and the apron, striped brown, with columns of red roses between, so many tiny stitches, the needle pulling the thread over and over and over. The door not yet closed on them, the moment rendered beautiful. Thank you.
So One of the aspects of reading and writing poetry that I appreciate the most at this time of my life is that poetry encourages us to slow down and pay attention. And for me, poetry often arrives in moments of heightened attention. The first poem I'll read is a tribute, I guess, to a wind chime that became my call to attention, I guess I'd say, during COVID. It hung outside of the music store. Many people, some locals might know the House of Musical Traditions, which was up the street from us in Tacoma Park. And also, this poem is dedicated to the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who was familiarly known as Thai because it was written the month that he died. A Monk's Bell for Thich Nhat Hanh, Thai, 1926 to 2022. A wind chime's deep-belled tone from a bare tree outside the music store lifts me from distraction, whether rounding the corner toward home after hurried errands into town or on walks to escape COVID cloister. Like a monk's bell, its four-note arpeggio in a minor key conducts my attention toward a slow coda, summons me to notice a bird's shadow on the sidewalk, sudden sun in a cloud break. This January day, an icy breeze twirls the chime's rounded trapezoid sail into a dancing orbit. A long cord suspends the clapper, but it's the sail that catches the wind, tuning it into the chord that delights me. I get out my cell phone to capture it on video, but resist. Instead, inhale a breath of gratitude, utter a prayer that Thai's soft voice, urging us to be mindful, will abide, not only in moments like these. Wind and melody subside. I pause in silence, smile, resolve to carry the teacher's gift. A little change of pace here. I appreciate poems that attempt to grapple with the many crises we're facing in our communities, country, planet. And I hope in this one that I've done that with a bit of humility and even a touch of humor. The poem is called Insects Are Vanishing from Our Lives, and it's a sestina, which is a 7-stanza poem with 6 endwords that get repeated in a very particular pattern, and it just seemed appropriate for something that was trying to hold on to both kind of humor, detail, rage, you name it. And it was inspired by a quote from the entomologist Edward O. Wilson. If all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed over 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And I'm dedicating this to all the scientists and gardeners and the environmental action folks on campus here. The first threat, that honeybees will vanish, taking with them 90% of plants that exist to feed us. 1 in 3 bites of all humankind consumes is stunning. In what mad state of delusion do we live as we swat insects left and right, inventing new pesticides to collapse nearly 200,000 species of bugs? Our own collapse would follow, toot sweet, as flowers vanish, fish die off, and grain silos empty. I admit insects bug me, not on my list of beings whose existence enthralls. Among my pet peeves, the estate of stink bugs in Amherst, Virginia, the abuse to my kind of black ants parading in the kitchen. Mankind clings to beauty, you say, as to comfort. We collapse these beings' unseen usefulness to low estate, ants ferrying food underground, a bee queen vanishing without her stinging minions, yet they exist as Jenga tower blocks. Try enjoying an insectless earth. All that's green now, desert. Without insects, every bioprocess spewing oxygen, humankind's very breath, gone. Then the question, do we exist for the planet or the planet for us? Say we collapse from our own avarice, self-centered acts. We vanish and all else regenerates, flourishes in a new state of equilibrium. Might our absence let creation gestate new species, mammals and fish whose insect-rich diet may restore air we dirtied, water that vanished as we overbred? Imagine the earth, humankind gone with its threat of world-ending war, the collapse of species relieved. A sudden peace may finally exist. Might be too far-fetched a dream. We exist here, now. Yet perhaps we've inherited a state of affairs we could remedy and so avert the collapse of what we love. Monarch butterflies, fireflies, insects we link with what's fleeting. Let humankind rewrite that dominion script before we vanish ourselves. Maybe prove we can exist beyond our vanishing gods. We might reinstate a version of humankind as steward, collapse our egos, become humble as insects. That was really fun to write, I must say. And my last poem is a haibun, which is a Japanese poetic form that combines short pieces of prose with little haiku, the short Japanese nature poems. And I don't think I've ever had a poem commissioned, but my husband, John Ruthroff, and I were on our way to Maine to do some schooner sailing, and visiting friends on our way up, I actually fell through a trapdoor that I did not know was there in the middle of the night. And John's friend said, "You have to write a poem about that." So, it actually has a kind of ironic title, which is a nautical term, Dead Reckoning, which the sailors in the room will recognize, which relates to trying to ascertain your position without traditional nautical instruments or stars. So, Dead Reckoning. First, the dark hole, unseen square of open space, my lost footing, the chaos of landing ushers in a week of pain, skin scraped into rough terrain, lying awake, musing on the risks of any fall at my age. Running downwind, past Eagle Island Light, the buoy bell. Now, days off anchor in Penobscot Bay, looking up at agile crew scaling the mast of a 100-foot catch, coiling lines, hauling the soggy weight of sails. Hard to reckon what's now frail in us, around us. Ancient rocks cradle endangered wildlife, an otter nosing up to peer at us, lobsters beneath, hobbled too by narrow escapes. Still, they inhabit these depths as their own. Sun-glistened bay, shadow of the rigging in our wake. Thank you. So now we'd like to open it up to you to ask us any questions about the poems we've read, about writing, any of it. And I know there are a lot of interesting and curious people in the crowd, so we're going to stay at our seats and we'll pass the microphone around to answer what you ask us. They're getting them.
Thank you. So, to each of you, do you decide that you're going to write a poem today? Or or for at a certain time of the day? Or do you wait for an inspiration and say, oh, that was interesting, I'll write a poem? How do you decide?
Yes. I think for me anyway, it happens both ways. Some mornings I just, a poet friend said that you need to get up and write something early in the morning when your mind is still kind of half awake. So when I'm really disciplined, I will often do that early-ish. But it's not a poem when I write it. I'll have to come back and make it into something. And then there just are some things like that day with the wind chime. I was like, I have to honor this with a poem. So it can happen both ways.
I'll just say that I'm completely irregular. I also write fiction, so sometimes for me, I do try to write every morning, but sometimes I'm like, am I writing a poem? Am I writing a story? Am I writing an essay? So I just tend to write, and then as things begin to take shape, I think maybe this wants to be a poem, but no regularity at all. It's one of my goals, one of these days.
I would say that I have in the past kept a notebook by my bed because sometimes lines of poetry come out of, or what I think could be a poem, come out of a dream. And if I get up and out of bed and the 2 feet hit the floor, the line could just vanish. So I try and write it down and go back to it. The other thing I would say is, being a journalist for all the years that I was, I'm very good on deadline. So if you gave me an assignment, I almost always can crank something out. And I would say the third way that I write is if something's been gnawing at me, and I will write something out longhand. I don't know when I'll get back to it, but I want to hold on to what the initial impulse was to choose to write a poem.
I would say it's probably most of my work comes from inspiration, and that inspiration might be, seeing the leaves falling off the trees, or, as Kathleen said in her poem about the wind chime, something that just strikes you. The hard part is that something will strike me, and I'll start writing, and then I'll say, where was I going with this? It's there, but how do you make it into a poem? So, but, that's more my style than I get up and write every day.
There you go.
I was wondering what you think about rap. Is that what? And I would like rap explained. Sorry, I'm showing my generation. Is it poetry, and what kind of poetry is it? And is it a new wave of poetry? What is happening?
I see they're looking to me. I think it's poetry. I think sometimes it's fabulous.
Yeah.
Rhymes, in particular, or those of us that like rhymes. And also this, whole poetry form called the spoken word. So I think it's in that, category, which is that someone is using their voice as an instrument and, either hoping to move you or, I think young people love it. And you can really have a powerful message. So I'm liberal, I think lots of things are poetry,
kind of form, or how was it?
Well, I think in some of these,
Sorry.
I don't know a lot of rappers, but a lot of them can do it spontaneously. That's the skill, that they can make it into a rhyming verse on command. And sometimes they compete with each other. So it'll almost be like a match. Like you said this, I said that.
Oh, right.
And it's not like it's not like I wrote it down in my notebook. It's coming from inside me.
Spontaneous.
Instinct
Yeah.
to know how to rhyme.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So I would just add that I really see it as a musical art form, okay? Rhyming is part of it, but I mean, in the past, plenty of songwriters have used rhyme that you would say, oh, that's a traditional song. It's a song of the street, it's a song of a community that utilizes rhyme in the lyrics.
I don't know if any of you have been to Planet Word, the museum in downtown Washington. One of the most fascinating little stations there is you put on the headphones and you're listening to a spoken word kind of rap beat poem, and it's scanning it. You're getting the poet, and it compares it to iambic pentameter. It's just fascinating to me, and the experiences I've had, I don't know if there are a lot of Hamilton fans in the house, but I always loved poetry that seemed to come out of body rhythm, really, as much as rhyme. And when we went to see Hamilton, of course, we had to listen to the soundtrack many, many times so that we would be sure we didn't miss anything. But it was just so artful, just to to see that really play itself out in such a dramatic way. Storytelling, right? In addition to the musicality and the rhythm. Yeah.
Frank, I think you need to get a rapper here.
I'd like to ask a question. This sort of goes along with what you've been saying. But what happened to rhyme for poetry? Why did free verse come and sort of take over? Were there no more, lists of words that rhymed that made sense anymore, that evoked what people wanted to say? Or why isn't there more rhyme in modern poetry?
Well, I'm going to pass it to Madeline, but first I'm going to say rap is the place you hear the rhyme. I mean, it is the form that uses that kind of rhyme and wordplay, but in a very different way than we're used to. But it's not gone.
Well, there are still poets who are writing in rhyme, first of all. There are some poets that specialize, say, in the sonnet, the traditional sonnet. I began writing poetry that mostly rhymes, traditional, and I wrote a lot of sonnets in my lifetime. I don't know, I mean, historically, I feel inadequate here to answer this question, but I believe that leaving the traditional form behind, I think poets of previous generations in the modern period, felt constrained by the form. They wanted to get away from that. So then we had what we called free verse, and many years of free verse. But the rhyme continued. There were still poets who continued to rhyme. Sometimes, you alluded to this, that sometimes you don't hear the rhyme. I mean, I don't know if you heard the rhyme in the sonnet that I read, but that was a rhymed poem. Sometimes there's internal rhyme, but I think you hear it, as Kathleen said, in rap, because it's end rhyme. It's a strict form, and it's very metrical. So the rhyme is emphasized because it's a very rhythmical, metrical thing, like iambic pentameter. I can only tell you for myself personally, you do feel constrained by a form, but the form sometimes helps you to find things that you wouldn't have found if you didn't have to play according to the rules, like tennis. So you have to follow those rules, and then you discover something. If you don't have that rule, then you're free. That's why we call it free verse. You're free to to get down whatever comes to your mind and not have to worry about, well, what rhymes with the word orange, you know, and figure out a way to get the word orange away from the end of the line so that you don't have to worry about rhyming it. So you're free of that, so that gives the poet a certain freedom. And I think then what happened with free verse was that we discovered that the spoken voice, you know, our own language, has a music to it that is not necessarily iambic pentameter and rhymes at the end. So line breaks become very important in the free verse poem. And you don't hear that. You only see it when it's on the page. That's enough from me.
Yeah, is this on? Yeah. I was just going to add to that. When I kind of deeply got into writing poetry, I wrote poetry in high school and then college. But around the 70s, there was a movement called confessional poetry. And I think that was, so someone like Sharon Olds, if you know her, she's really about getting to the bone, you know, and writing truly, I think, moving poetry. But I would say that her subject matter propelled her rather than, in free verse, rather than another choice. That she wanted the story to come forward. Does that sound fair?
I think Frank is getting up to wrap us up. Is there any other burning question? Okay. All right, Rodney, you can yell, right? There's a microphone. Give him a microphone.
I will get the mic because there are those who just need this to help them hear better. When creating a poem, when you're in that space, in that chair, with your pad in front of you, and the creative urge takes you away, as it does with painters, as it does with musicians, do the walls melt away?
Well, I feel it less spatially and more, I guess, kind of, it's a feeling of like, it must be like what an athlete feels when you're really in the zone. You are in a different place. It happens to me more when I'm off at one of these writers' retreats or something like that. Like that Sestina came out of being isolated from everything, sitting in a little studio in France for 2 or 3 weeks and reading all these articles about the insect Armageddon, right? And then it just kind of poured out. And sometimes I describe it as being in the zone, and anything could be going on around me, and I'm not there. I'm like into my flow. That's kind of how I experience it. I do want to mention, however, that for those of you that don't know, that there is an Asbury Poetry group now called the Asbury Poetry Lovers, and Lurleen Peeler is back there. You want to wave, Lurleen? If you don't know Lurleen, she's the leader of the band right now. And we meet on the second Thursday of the month from 3 to 4:30 in the Edwards Fisher Library. Not everybody's a poet, but we all love poetry, and people bring poems to share. And so all are welcome, and we'd love to have you. And there's actually a copy of the Asbury Poetry Anthology that's recently been published that you can order yourself on Amazon. And we have some books here, so any of you that can hang around and would like to look at some books or talk to us about buying a book, we'd be happy. And thank you again, Frank and Keese School, for bringing us back. This is so much fun.